Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest iteration of the web series The Princess and the Human. If you are new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 30, Sick Visit. At least 24 heads turned as the doors of the large shuttle opened, and 2 rows of heavily armed guards marched out into the light of the rising sun. When their total number counted 8 pairs, they stopped and formed a corridor. Silvani personally doubted the necessity of this presentation, not least because she was here for private reasons, but she understood that this was a formality expected from her, especially since this was her first public appearance since her return. Even if this wasn't really a public appearance, she simply had something to do here, and here happened to be a public space. Straightening her green cape, the symbol of her status, she stood up and exited. As quick as she could, while looking dignified, she made her way towards a group of buildings in front of her. Her guards also started moving so that she was right in the middle of their formation. Silvani had always been of the opinion that it looked ridiculous how she towered over her escorts. Most members of her family, from her father's side, were above average in height, but she was tall even when compared to them. Her uncle always called her figure imposing, rather than silly, as a child. But that was at best marginally better. She wasn't a warrior. There was no point in being imposing. Leaving the landing platform behind them, her group walked along the broad pathway leading to the entrance. It was a wide paved alley, framed by statues of various venereal and alien species. Like most institutions in the great harbor town, the Kalhanar Hospital was designed for the purpose of being able to cater to the needs of every known otherworlder. Of course, the only otherworlders visiting Homne were the few political guests each cycle, so they almost never had patients who weren't venereal. Still, if something were to happen to Silvani's guests, they were equipped to handle it. As they walked, the other people visiting the hospital quickly cleared the way, most of them bowing when she passed them. Going by all the talks that started around her, she undoubtedly sparked some rumors with her appearance. And because of all this racket, it was of no surprise that the hospital's receptionist was already standing at attention when she finally reached the doors. "Your Highness," she greeted with a deep bow. "How may I be of assistance?" Instead of answering, Silvani pointed further inside to indicate that she didn't wish to publicly announce it. The receptionist nodded and guided her to an empty waiting room. When they were finally cut off from the public eye, she announced that she planned to visit Kayatin. Nodding once more, the receptionist called for the head physician, who didn't let her wait for long. "My greetings, Your Highness. If I may introduce myself, I am Jarchow of the clan Jorian, third son of Baroness Marian and Baron Teska, head of this clinic." Teska, the princess wondered, like Tesvani. How did someone from her mother's clan end up as a baron? Well, it wasn't important at the moment. "I apologize for visiting without prior announcement," she responded. "I hope that you weren't forced to leave a patient because of me." "Do not worry, Your Highness. To be honest, I was just getting out of bed when you arrived, since I spent most of last night in the operating room." Gesturing to the door, different than the one through which she had entered, the doctor led her into an empty corridor. She assumed this was so high-ranking visitors weren't subjected to unwanted onlookers. "Your brother is not awake at the moment," he explained as they walked, "but if you want to see him, that won't be a problem. However, with all due respect, I must ask you to be quiet while in this room." Silvani nodded. "How is he?" "He is, stable, at least for now. So far, we, unfortunately couldn't figure out the unknown substance he came into contact with. It makes me wonder if maybe someone dumped toxic waste in the forest. But whatever it is, it's drastically weakened his shell, which then tore." The princess nodded, though she didn't listen too carefully. Since she probably knew more than the doctor about this unknown substance, she was mainly concerned about his chances of recovery. "But his shell didn't melt, did it?" "No, I mean, like melting? No, nothing of the sorts. Although, now that you say it, if someone was already close to their molting, the substance could work similarly to her tinctures, some used to molt early, albeit much stronger. Maybe if it's thinned down, who knows? Maybe that's exactly what the substance was meant to be, a failed experiment, or too successful." Subconsciously, Silvani moved her hand over to the piece of cloth that covered a wide cavity on her belly. They walked for a while, going 2 stories up, until they passed what had to be an entire platoon of guards and reached the door. The doctor opened, but didn't enter with her. Only she went in. For a while, she stood there in silence, looking at the pile of pillows and bandages shaped like a brother. He didn't move, just lay there, peacefully. Almost like, no, she told herself. He's just asleep. Just asleep. The way the large bed made him look even smaller than he really was reminded her of Nadine. Nadine. Silvani was conflicted. No matter how she spun it, the small alien had almost killed her brother. Not intentionally, of course. She would never impute that to her. Nadine was a sweet and loving girl, and Silvani cared deeply for her. It had been nothing more than a moment of carelessness. However, Nadine had known that her sweat had at least some reaction to them, and that was on top of her monstrous strength. Carelessness was something she couldn't afford. Sure, one could call it unfair, and rightfully so. Despite her age, Nadine was still a child, which was already bizarre in its own, and it was clear how much she suffered from all of this. She was a victim of the circumstances, and Silvani truly wished to help her. Not only that, her connection with Kaiten seemed to affect her brother in a very positive way. But if it meant risking this... Lastly, there was the topic of her parents. They would sooner or later hear about this, and withholding this information was not a good idea. Kaiten was as much their son as he was her brother. They had the right to know. She didn't know if Nadine was ready for it, but there simply wasn't a point in delaying it longer. She didn't know how much time she had spent lost in thoughts, but when she exited her brother's room, the doctor was still waiting for her. Say, she asked as he walked her back, how are his chances of recovery? That depends. As far as we can tell, the damage is mostly exterior. Molting should fix the problem, in theory. And in reality, well, according to the medical records his doctor sent us, his first molting is expected in a bit under a cycle. And right now, his shell is really weak. One thoughtless movement can, and probably will, cause a new tear. To be blunt, until he molts, he'll be a nursing case. That really had been as blunt as a punch to the face. And hearing this didn't feel too different from that. Her brother, always so lively and full of energy, being tied to the bed for up to an entire cycle. She almost couldn't imagine it. And I'm afraid that is not all. There's more, she slipped, sounding way more panicked than she usually allowed herself in public. Yes, you see, it is possible that he'll molt sooner than estimated, but it is fairly clear that his new shell is still in the process of forming, meaning that there is a high chance that it got damaged as well. So while I am fairly certain that molting once will help, it is likely he won't fully recover until he molts again. Silvani swallowed. That was bad. The second molting usually happened around the age of 7 to 9 cycles, probably closer to the latter since Kaiten was a bit of a late bloomer. In other words, so what you're saying is by the time he fully recovers, he'll be close to adulthood. That is what it looks like for now, yes. Though we can only be certain once the new shell has finished forming. Would it help if you had some of that unknown substance? We don't necessarily need it to help your brother, but it could solve some unknowns, so if you happen to procure some, I wouldn't refuse it. And with that, they were back in the waiting room. If you wish, we can inform you should his condition change, but to be honest, this facility wasn't made to host long-term patients. Once it is safe to transport him, we'll probably send him to Weimar. Silvani nodded. Weimar, also known as the Sun City, was the planet's capital. It was also where the Sun Palace and Sky Palace were located, meaning their parents would be able to visit him frequently. It was probably for the best. Looking at the clock, she realized that almost 3 invers had passed since her arrival. Word probably had gone around by now, so she braced herself for the journalist, who would undoubtedly wait for her. To her surprise, she was proven wrong. The foyer was almost empty, and a few people present paid no attention to her. Instead, they were all focused on something outside. Upon leaving the hospital, Silvani spotted a new shuttle, even larger than hers. From the shuttle, framed by even more guards than her, a man walked towards her. He was tall, albeit slightly smaller than her, and wore a cape similar to hers, except his was blue rather than green. Shilgvani, he called out to her in surprise when he reached her. The princess lowered her head. Greetings, father. That was rather unexpected. Not that he came, but that he was thus quick. After all, her parents usually resided on the other side of the planet. Assuming the hospital had contacted them yesterday night when Kaiten had been hospitalized, Her father would have needed to rush off the moment he had gotten the news. In hindsight, it fits his character and explains why he looks so tired. Is mother with you? No. She'll visit once I return. I assume that you are here for the same reason as I. Yes. I was just on my way back, though I couldn't talk with him. He was asleep. And is he... His life is not in danger right now, but recovery will take time. The king angrily shook his head. Just by what the first ones happened. Did somebody attack him? Were his guards that useless? No attack, Silvani quickly corrected him. It was an accident. Honestly, it's at least partially my fault. He cocked his head. How so? An important guest arrived yesterday. I didn't want him to cause trouble, so I asked him to spend the day elsewhere. He went to the forest, a couple of invers east of Star Palace, and there, She shook her head. That was it then. She had to tell them about Nadine. Omitting her in the reports was one thing, but she couldn't directly lie to her father. She had to tell him, even if it wasn't good time for Nadine. Nadine, who hadn't wanted any of this to happen. Nadine, who hadn't hesitated to put herself in harm's way to protect them. Nadine, who since her arrival on the planet suffered under the deeds she had to do. Nadine, who since she came back from the forest had locked herself in her room and refused to let anyone near her. He came into contact with some unknown substance. The doctor assumes that someone dumped toxic waste in the forest. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, HenryTheRed, Casper Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.